So, um, usually when we talk about theoretical physics, there is this kind of unstated assumption of a stage. You know what I mean?
Right, yeah, like a background.
Exactly. Like you construct a building, the walls enclose a volume, and you can point to the living room and say, well, that is an empty space where events can occur.
Mm.
And historically, we have treated the universe itself the exact same way.
Yeah, as a container.
Right. We think of it as this massive pre-existing container.
Hmm.
But when you step into the world of modern information physics, which we're doing today, um, someone completely pulls that stage out from under you.
They really do. It's a total paradigm shift.
It is. We are looking at a conceptual landscape today that is going to completely dismantle your baseline intuition about reality. So I want you to frame this audio track in your mind as a slow, deliberate, step-by-step foundation.
Yeah, we really need to take our time with this one.
We are going to go slow today.
Yeah.
And we are going to build a completely new mental model of existence from the ground up.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? We're moving from a universe-first model to an observer-first model.
And to give you some context on what we're actually exploring, it's an independent theoretical framework called Observer Patch Holography, or OPH for short.
OPH.
Yeah, developed by Bernhard Mueller. And to understand the magnitude of this research, we really have to recognize that it does not just, attempt to add a patch or a minor tweak to the existing models of physics.
Like it's not just fixing a little math error.
No, not at all. It literally challenges the foundational premise of established science because historically, like you said, physics assumes reality is there first and the observer is just an add-on.
Like a passive witness?
Exactly. A passive entity just looking through a window at a universe that would exist regardless of whether anyone was looking at it. But this research brings the observer, or rather networks of observers, into the absolute center stage.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. Without the observer, the stage literally does not exist.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. I'm Satosha.
And I'm Satoshi.
Okay, so that is the pitch for our journey today. There are two key discoveries we are going to unpack. First, like we just said, reality is not a pre-existing container we live inside. It is actually a consensus protocol.
Built entirely by overlapping perspective.
Right. And second, everything you see around you, from the gravity holding your feet to the floor, to the fundamental particles composing your cells, it's all simply the universe's way of preventing these overlapping perspectives from experiencing logical paradoxes.
It's basically a massive error correction system.
Exactly. So by the end of this deep dive, you will look at space, time, and your own consciousness in a radically different way. You'll be motivated to explore how information, not physical matter, is the ultimate fabric of existence.
So let's start with the crisis that necessitated this radical shift in the first place. Anyone who follows modern physics knows about the profound tension between our two most successful frameworks.
Right, the big clash.
Yeah. General relativity gives us this beautiful, smooth, continuous macroscopic picture of gravity and space-time.
The big stuff, planets, galaxies.
Exactly. But then the standard model of particle physics gives us a quantum field theory that is discrete, probabilistic, and heavily pixelated at the microscopic level.
And we know they mathematically refuse to cooperate.
Right.
Like if you try to calculate the gravitational field of an electron using general relativity, the equations just blow up into infinity.
They completely break down. It's a mathematical crash.
Yeah. For the last 50 years, the Holy Grail has been a theory of everything that forces these two models to marry. We've seen string theory, we've seen loop quantum gravity, and the historical approach has always been to take this pre-existing classical geometry and figure out a way to chop it up into quantum bits.
Right, trying to quantize the container itself. But observer patch holography argues that this historical approach is just fundamentally inverted. Trying to quantize a pre-existing background geometry assumes the background is fundamental.
Which it isn't, according to this.
Right. OPH starts underneath them both. It redefines reality entirely as an information theoretic process. It asserts there is no God's eye view.
No objective external universe sitting out there waiting to be looked at.
Exactly.
Okay, let me bring in a structural analogy here to help visualize this, maybe something from network architecture. Think about how massive multiplayer online games were traditionally built. You have a central server.
Right, the mega computer running the game.
Yeah, and that server is the definitive universe. It holds the master copy of all the physics, all the spatial coordinates, all the items. Your local console just logs in, sends your inputs, and the server dictates back to you what the objective reality is.
And standard physics treats space-time exactly like that central server.
Perfect, yeah. The universe computes itself globally. But OPH says reality is a peer-to-peer network, right? There is no central server. There is no master container holding everything. The physical world only exists because individual consoles, the observers, are constantly syncing up and agreeing on the data they share.
They have to form a consensus.
Exactly. If my node says a physical object occupies a specific coordinate and your node's field of view overlaps with mine, our systems have to execute a handshake protocol. They have to agree on the data.
Or the network crashes.
Yeah. The object doesn't exist on a server somewhere. It manifests dynamically purely because of the forced agreement between our local machines.
That is a perfect way to conceptualize it. In OPH, the fundamental unit of reality is what the research calls the observer patch.
The observer patch, okay.
Yeah, you can visualize this as a finite capacity holographic screen. Space isn't an empty void separating things. Space is woven entirely from the quantum correlations, the complex data synchronization between these local observer screens.
So that's all about data transfer.
Absolutely. No single observer possesses the mathematical capacity to render the entire universe. You only have access to your local patch.
So when I look out the window right now, I am not looking through a void. I'm experiencing the localized output of a massive, ongoing data syncing protocol.
You are. Reality is the emergent structure that crystallizes when these partial perspectives are forced to maintain consistency where they overlap.
Okay, let me make sure I'm getting this.
If you and I are evaluating the same region of the world, our mathematical descriptions must align. If they don't, the logical structure of the reality we co-inhabit fails to cohere.
Wow.
Yeah. The laws of physics, therefore, aren't arbitrary rules imposed from above by a central server. The laws of physics are literally the required synchronization algorithms that maintain network consistency.
This represents such a heavy structural shift in thinking that it really requires sitting quietly with the primary research to let the implications settle. I mean, this isn't something you just skim.
No, definitely not.
To really map out this peer-to-peer reality, you have to read the underlying math and logic. And, if you are the type who likes to read the primary research without distractions, head to our research website. We designed it for deep focus. There are no trackers, no cookies, no logins required.
Just a clean reading space.
Pure reading experience the way the internet was supposed to be. The link is in the description. And the best part is that our deep dive website is a progressive web app now.
Which is so convenient.
It really is. You can install it straight from your browser onto your PC, your tablet, or even your phone, and you can read this mind-bending physics on the beach or on a flight entirely offline, saving your Wi-Fi and mobile data while completely reconstructing your view of the universe.
It demands that level of uninterrupted focus. Because once you accept that reality is a network of observer screens syncing up, the immediate and most critical question becomes, well, what are the specific rules of that synchronization protocol?
Right. How does it actually work?
Exactly. How does a peer-to-peer network construct a stable universe without crashing into paradoxes?
Because every protocol has underlying code. The research lays out 5 specific rules, or axioms, for the reality game. And we are going to translate the dense mathematics of these axioms into rigorous conceptual logic. Let's start with axiom 1.
Axiom 1 is finite capacity.
Okay.
This dictates that every perspective, every single observer patch, has a strict, mathematically defined limit on its information density. Your holographic screen can only hold a finite amount of data.
Like a hard drive limit.
Basically, yeah. In the framework of OPH, this implies that the universe possesses a literal pixel size at the foundational level, which is directly related to the Planck scale.
Which fundamentally alters how we view black holes, for instance. Because standard physics allows for infinite density, a singularity, which is essentially a mathematical crash.
Exactly. Infinity breaks the equations.
But by enforcing a strict finite capacity, OPH ensures that infinities can never form. Reality is hard-capped on resolution.
Precisely. It solves the singularity problem immediately. Then we have axiom 2, which is the local patch algebra. This defines the boundaries of an observer's knowledge.
Okay, I picture this like the fog of war in a strategy game. You only have vision of the terrain immediately surrounding your units. The rest of the map is unrendered to you.
That's a great way to put it. It is a profound epistemological limit. In the mathematics of OPH, an observer state is described by a specific algebraic structure. You only have access to the observable data within your local algebra.
So what about the rest of the universe?
Information from the rest of the universe isn't just hidden from you. For your patch, it is formally undefined until it is glued into your local description through overlaps with other patches. You simply cannot transcend your local algebra.
Okay, which brings us to the engine of the entire framework, Axiom 3, overlap consistency. And the research explicitly states this is the most important rule.
It absolutely is. This is the mechanism that lifts the fog of war you just mentioned. It does not lift because you move into a pre-existing space. It lifts because your algebraic structure overlaps with your neighbor's algebraic structure. Where two screens overlap, their stories must agree.
Forced agreement.
Yes. In mathematical terms, this is handled by specific consistency conditions. If your screen dictates the presence of an energy excitation, and my screen overlaps with that specific topological region, my screen's math must map perfectly to yours to reflect that exact same excitation.
So if I see a particle, you have to see it too, if we're looking at the same spot.
Exactly. If the universe were not strictly constrained by this forced mathematical agreement, it would dissolve into a disjointed heap of independent static. The geometry of space and time is born entirely out of this desperate structural need for overlapping patches to agree.
Okay, let me introduce some friction here on Axiom 4, minimal admissible realization, or MA.
Yeah.
The research calls this an informational Occam's razor.
Right.
It states that nature selects the absolute simplest mathematical structure to satisfy the overlap agreement. But my brain immediately rejects that premise. Because if nature is lazy, why is the universe so absurdly complicated? I mean, why do we have the messy particle zoo, chaotic quantum fields, and complex bosons if nature demands the simplest possible math? A totally empty void is infinitely simpler than a universe with quarks and gluons.
An empty void is simpler, yes, but an empty void does not contain observers. You have to remember Axiom 5, which we will touch on in a second, which says the system must contain the observers themselves.
Yeah, right. We have to be here to look at it.
Exactly. Once you have observers with local data patches that are mandated by Axiom 3 to overlap and agree, a completely empty void is no longer a mathematically viable solution.
It wouldn't work.
Right. The complexity we observe, like the specific structure of the standard model, the behavior of gravity, OPH demonstrates that this specific complexity is the absolute minimal, simplest possible way to maintain a multi-observer consensus without generating logical contradictions.
So the quarks and the black holes aren't superfluous complexity. Given the sheer volume of data being shared across trillions of overlapping patches, the current laws of physics are literally the cheapest computational solution to keep the peer-to-peer network from crashing.
That's beautifully stated. The realized physics is the minimal, non-trivial solution to the overlap conditions. Anything simpler would fail to satisfy the requirement that all observers agree on the shared boundaries.
That reframes complexity entirely. Okay, so let's cover the final rule, Axiom 5, the strange loop.
The strange loop hypothesis directly addresses the teleology, like the origin of the system. Why does this network exist at all? It posits that reality is a self-referential, timeless causal structure.
A closed loop.
Exactly. It aligns closely with physicist John Archibald Wheeler's concept of the participatory universe. The universe generates observers. Those observers evolve, construct local algebraic patches, discover the laws of physics through their overlaps, and fundamentally instantiate the very system that created them. It closes the loop of causality.
The universe is an engine for generating observers, so those observers can observe the universe into existence.
Precisely.
Okay, before we move into how these rules actually project the physical dimensions we experience, let's just pause and make sure we've grounded this. We're asking you to check in with yourself here. Does this make sense? We're essentially saying that reality operates on 5 pillars.
Limited resolution.
Right. Strictly local viewpoints. Mandatory consensus, where views meet. The most computationally cheap method to maintain that consensus. And a self-causing loop of participation.
Having established that rule set, we can now examine how the geometry of a local observer's screen projects the actual three-dimensional space we inhabit.
Because in standard physics, having 3 spatial dimensions, length, width, height, and 1 temporal dimension, time, it's a given. It's the unquestioned background metric. But in OPH, the 3D space isn't assumed. It is derived.
It is a strict geometric requirement of the observer's information screen. OPH defines the observer's horizon mathematically as a 2-dimensional spherical surface.
A 2D sphere. Okay.
Through the symmetry rules governing how information flows on that boundary, it mathematically projects a 3-dimensional plus time bulk inward.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The dimensions we experience as time and radial distance are not fundamental. They are projected inward from the boundary data of the 2D sphere.
So it is a literal realization of the holographic principle.
Yeah.
The room I am sitting in right now, the depth of the physical objects around me, are holographic projections of the 2D data on my observer screen, dynamically syncing with the screens of other nodes.
Yes. And this framework forces a complete reevaluation of gravity. In Einstein's general relativity, gravity is a fundamental pulling force, right? The result of massive objects warping the pre-existing stage of space-time.
Right, the bowling ball on a trampoline analogy.
But if space-time is just a holographic projection from a boundary screen, what is gravity pulling on?
Yeah, if the stage doesn't exist, why do objects fall?
In OPH, gravity is an equation of state. It is a thermodynamic consistency condition of information balance. When information flows across the boundaries of these overlapping patches, it has to remain balanced to prevent those paradoxes we keep mentioning.
So gravity is just balancing the books.
Exactly. Gravity is simply what large-scale information consistency looks like mathematically.
Let's ground equation of state with an analogy. In thermodynamics, we have the ideal gas law. We can describe a balloon using macro properties like temperature, pressure, and volume. But pressure isn't a fundamental force at the microscopic level, right?
No, not at all.
Pressure emerges from the statistical average of trillions of atoms bouncing against the rubber. You don't calculate the vector of every single atom to understand pressure.
And gravity operates on the exact same emergent logic. Gravity is not a microscopic pulling force between two fundamental particles. It is the large-scale statistical requirement that the shared information between patches remains stationary across boundaries.
Okay, so what happens when something heavy enters the picture?
When a massive object is introduced, it alters the information density in a local patch. To maintain the mandatory overlap consistency, the geometric projection of the surrounding space has to adjust its metric. We perceive that geometric adjustment as the gravitational field.
That makes so much sense. And this emergent view of gravity solves what is arguably the most embarrassing mathematical discrepancy in modern physics.
The cosmological constant problem.
Yes, exactly. Explain what that is.
The cosmological constant problem arises because quantum mechanics dictates that the vacuum of space is not empty. It is teeming with quantum vacuum energy. When standard physics attempts to calculate the gravitational effect of this vacuum energy, the resulting number is catastrophic.
Yeah, it's completely broken.
It is off by a factor of 10 to the power of 120. The energy should be so intense that it curves the universe into an immediate crunch.
But obviously we are here, and space is relatively flat. We haven't crunched. So how does OPH resolve this massive discrepancy?
Because gravity in OPH is an information balancing protocol, the protocol inherently features a filter. OPH demonstrates that the emergence of gravity from patch data is structurally blind to uniform vacuum energy.
Blind to it.
Yes. Gravity emerges specifically from how information flows along the light-like boundaries of the patch. The flow along this boundary is mathematically invariant under constant uniform shifts in the background energy. It only reacts to gradients.
Gradients, meaning differences.
Exactly. To excitations or differences in information.
So because the vacuum energy is uniform everywhere, the synchronization protocol simply ignores it. It structurally filters out the uniform background noise to prevent the network from crashing under its own weight.
That's exactly how it works.
It's an elegant filtering mechanism. And, much like the rigid filtering process we have to apply when we build these deep dives, we don't just take the raw noise of the internet and broadcast it. Listeners send us sources, we obsess over them, and we find the hidden theme.
The actual signal in the noise.
All right. Then we unleash Gemini Pro to go full internet detective. We validate everything across thousands of signals. Then we handcraft and polish the research, painfully refine every word, compress it into tight, no-fluff audio, and design the sound, the mood, and the visuals.
It's quite a process.
And for the video side of things, we build the motion graphics. Minimalist, clean, high-contrast typography, simple geometric accents, subtle kinetic text reveals, and calm, premium pacing. We use strong hierarchy and white space with Mosaic. Mosaic is an absolute game changer when it comes to video. It allows us to filter out the visual noise and present the pure structural signal of the concept.
Which perfectly mirrors how the patch boundary filters the quantum vacuum to project a stable macroscopic geometry.
So we have established that gravity is the macro-scale balancing of information. Let's zoom in now. What about the microworld? What is the physical matter that makes us up? Where do electrons, quarks, and the strong and weak forces come from if there's no central server dictating their existence?
Well, the standard model of particle physics is essentially an ad hoc table of observations. It is incredibly accurate, but it doesn't explain why the particles have the specific properties they do.
We just kind of found them and named them.
Exactly. We observe that there are specific types of quarks and leptons, and we catalog them. But OPH derives the standard model directly from the microscopic rules of patch gluing.
We briefly touched on patch gluing earlier. That's the mechanism where two overlapping screens align their data.
Yes. To understand how matter emerges, we have to look at gauge symmetry. In standard quantum field theory, gauge symmetry involves highly complex mathematics that dictates how fields interact. But conceptually, within OPH, gauge symmetry is simply the mathematical redundancy that occurs when two overlapping patches attempt to align their local reference frames.
Okay, wait, redundant how? Let me try an analogy.
hmm
If I have a highly detailed map of a city in English, and you have a map of the exact same city in Japanese, the physical city hasn't changed, right?
Right, the streets are exactly the same.
But our coordinate labels and language are completely different.
Yeah.
So when we overlap our maps to agree on a route, we discover a redundancy in the labeling system. We have to establish a translation protocol to glue our maps together so that my north and coffee shop map perfectly to your corresponding symbols.
Gauge symmetry is exactly that translation protocol. When two observer patches overlap, there is an inherent degree of freedom in how their local mathematical descriptions are oriented. The boundary conditions require charge labels to specify how these patches fit together consistently.
Ah, charge labels.
Yeah. The complex rules dictating how these labels fuse across the boundary mathematically reconstruct the exact structures of the strong, weak, and electromagnetic forces. The fundamental forces of nature are not invisible tellers pulling objects. They are the mandatory translation protocols required to maintain consistency between overlapping maps.
That is beautiful. And the research explicitly addresses why the standard model contains exactly 3 generations of matter particles.
It does.
For context, we have the electron, the muon, and the tau particle. They're essentially 3 versions of the exact same particle, just escalating in mass. Standard physics offers no foundational reason why there shouldn't be 4 or 5 or only 1 generation.
OPH derives the existence of exactly 3 generations through a topological mechanism combined with a requirement for stability. When information is projected from the boundary screen into the bulk, the internal data has to stabilize.
Okay, like a rendering process settling down.
Kind of. The topology of the boundary dictates that this refinement process only reaches a stable mathematical configuration after exactly 3 iterations. 3 generations isn't a random roll of the cosmic dice. It is the unique topological configuration required for the observer patch architecture to remain stable.
This brings us to what I consider the most staggering claim in the entire paper, the quantitative precision of the pixel area constant.
This is where OPH crosses the threshold from a beautiful theoretical philosophy into highly falsifiable hard science.
Let's get into it.
The entire framework relies on just one fundamental structural constant, labeled P. This represents the fundamental pixel area of the holographic screen. It has a specific dimensionless value of approximately 1.63094.
Okay, one constant.
Yes. Using only this single structural constant, derived purely from the geometry of the information screen, OPH predicts the exact masses of the fundamental particles.
Let me state exactly what the research claims here because it's nuts. It predicts the mass of the electron to within 4 parts in 10,000. It predicts the mass of the Z boson to the exact same accuracy. It predicts the top quark mass to within 1%. It is not taking measurements in a lab and retrofitting the math. It is mathematically deriving what the physical masses must be based solely on the pixel size of reality.
And achieving that requires a fundamental redefinition of what mass actually is.
Yeah, I really have to wrestle with this because my intuition about mass is entirely physical. When I try to push a heavy boulder, I feel visceral, physical resistance in my muscles. I feel weight. The research defines mass as the entropy cost or bandwidth cost of a particle surviving the journey across overlapping screens. I struggle to map the physical friction I feel in my muscles to informational network lag.
Well, the physical resistance you feel is the macroscale manifestation of that microscale informational friction.
Okay, how?
For a localized excitation of information, a particle, to propagate through space, it must continually survive the refinement process as it translates across the shifting holographic screens of the environment's overlapping patches. The mass of the particle mathematically represents the entropy cost of that translation.
Like downloading a huge file.
Yes. Heavy particles, like the top quark, have a massive bandwidth cost to translate across the patches, which makes them highly unstable. They decay rapidly into later configurations. Lighter particles, like electrons, have a very low bandwidth cost, making them stable.
So when I push the boulder,
When you push a boulder, you are attempting to uniformly update the spatial coordinates of trillions of localized information packets across the environmental boundary. The resistance you feel is fundamentally the aggregate energy required to update that massive quantum state space across the network consensus. Mass is literally a transport obstruction.
if the framework can predict the mass of an electron from pure boundary geometry, what happens when we apply this lens to the macro world? Let's turn to astrophysics. The framework makes a definitive statement on dark matter.
It does. In standard cosmology, dark matter was hypothesized to solve a glaring observational anomaly. When we measure the rotation curves of galaxies, the outer edges are spinning far too fast for the amount of visible, luminous matter contained within them.
According to standard gravitational models, the galaxies should literally fly apart.
So, to preserve the existing equations, the physics community proposed dark matter, an invisible, non-interacting substance that supposedly makes up the vast majority of the universe's mass.
And despite decades of incredibly sophisticated experiments, we have never detected a single dark matter particle.
Not one. OPH provides a structural explanation that eliminates the need for invisible particles entirely. OPH predicts that dark matter does not exist as a physical entity. It is an artifact of imperfect patch gluing.
How does the gluing fail at that scale?
Well, at small to medium scales, like within our solar system, the overlap consistency between observer patches is nearly perfect, which is why Newton and Einstein's equations hold up flawlessly. However, as you scale up to vast galactic distances, the mathematical requirement that the data on one side of a boundary perfectly reconstructs the data on the other side begins to suffer from a microscopic geometric deviation.
Like a rounding error.
Sort of. The curvature of the massive macro screen introduces an unavoidable boundary defect. This imperfection introduces a tiny structural correction to the gravitational potential.
So the mapping protocol has a built-in error rate over vast distances, and that error rate mathematically manifests as additional gravitational binding, which looks exactly like extra mass.
Precisely. OPH actually derives the specific acceleration scale at which this deviation becomes noticeable, which perfectly fits the galactic rotation curves directly from the curvature of the holographic screen. It does this without inventing any free parameters or invoking undetectable phantom particles.
This reliance on structural minimalism brings us back to axiom 4, the minimal admissible realization. And it uses that axiom to completely dismantle another popular theory, the multiverse.
Frameworks like string theory predict a landscape of 10 to the power of 500 possible universes, all with randomly dialed laws of physics. The theory suggests we just happen to live in the lucky bubble that supports observers.
The ultimate lottery ticket.
Yeah, but OPH rejects the multiverse as mathematically bloated and unnecessary.
Because according to MAR, our universe isn't a lucky roll of the dice. It is the unique survivor of the consistency filter. While infinite other configurations might look plausible on a mathematician's chalkboard, they are not stable network architectures. If you tried to run them, the observer patches would fail to form a stable overlap consensus, and the system would instantly crash.
Exactly.
The physics we experience is the only unique, stable configuration that allows the self-referential loop to close.
It replaces the infinite randomness of the multiverse with a strict, logically mandated necessity.
If there are no parallel universes sprawling out across a multiverse landscape, how does OPH handle the weirdness of quantum mechanics? Specifically, the many worlds interpretation. The popular idea is that every time a quantum superposition collapses, every time a decision is made, reality physically bifurcates. A universe where the particle spins up and a separate universe where the particle spins down.
OPH completely solves the measurement problem of quantum mechanics without ever requiring a reality to split.
How so?
The measurement problem asks why a quantum system exists in a probabilistic blur until it is measured, at which point it snaps into a single definite state. Standard physics often treats the observer as a classical external entity that somehow disturbs the quantum system into collapsing.
But OPH says that entire framing is backwards, because there is no classical external stage.
Exactly right. A quantum superposition, the state of being in multiple possibilities at once, is not a physical property of a particle hovering in space. It is strictly an incomplete description relative to one local observer patch. It means the information required to define that state is not yet present in your local algebra.
Going back to our strategy game analogy, if a unit is hidden in the fog of war, it isn't physically smeared across 100 different tiles simultaneously. It's just that my local console hasn't received the coordinate data yet.
And when your patch finally overlaps with the patch containing that specific information, a synchronization event occurs. The communication protocol of the universe mandates that two observers cannot share a half outcome. The consistency conditions demand definitive agreement to avoid a paradox.
Right.
Therefore, wave function collapse is not a violent physical event happening to a particle. It is a mandatory synchronization update executing across the peer-to-peer network. The universe forces a definite result, so the participating nodes do not desync.
That completely reframes quantum mechanics from mystical weirdness into pure information theory. But how does this create the solid, objective reality we interact with? The research heavily emphasizes something called the Born-Lueders record package. What exactly is a record package, and how does it make a chair feel solid?
This touches on a fundamental rule of quantum mechanics called the no-cloning theorem, which states you cannot perfectly copy an unknown quantum state. If reality is a peer-to-peer network, how can multiple observers agree on the state of a chair if they aren't allowed to copy the data describing it?
Oh, that's a huge problem.
It is, but OPH identifies that within the complex algebraic overlaps, certain structures, the records, reside in the mathematical center of the algebra. The center consists of operators that commute with every other operator in the algebra.
And because they commute with everything, observing them doesn't disturb the complementary variables, like you can look at them safely.
Correct. Because they commute, these specific records can be perfectly copied and broadcast across patches without violating the quantum no-cloning restriction. These copyable records become the macroscopic objective facts of our reality. They are the data packets that survive the consensus protocol.
So the physical chair I'm sitting on is real and objective, specifically because the data describing it exists as a Born-Lueders record package that can be freely copied and shared to your observer patch, establishing a shared macro reality. Objectivity is just highly resilient, shared subjectivity.
That is an excellent summary.
And those objective facts only exist because they can be copied and shared across the network to establish consensus. Sharing information to build consensus is the entire point. In fact, if you want to expand the consensus on this kind of theoretical framework, we want to invite you to share this show with your friends or wherever they geek out on deep physics and the nature of reality.
We really appreciate that.
For audio, we are on all major platforms: Fountain.fm, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube Music. Links are on our research website, link in the description. For short videos, we are on YouTube and Spotify under the podcast named Slopcast. As you know, we are still experimenting with building long-form videos with Mosaic AI Video Editor, so think of the short vids as still a test phase, but we really do want your feedback. Our goal is to keep videos simple, calm, and free from distractions. By the way, Mosaic launched a new app called Motion recently, which is exactly what we needed for our kind of content. We highly recommend our community check it out. The link is in the description.
Expanding the network of observers is an incredibly fitting transition to the next profound implication of OPH. We have discussed how the network constructs space, gravity, mass, and objective facts. But what about the node itself? What does this mathematical framework imply about human consciousness?
The infamous hard problem of consciousness. How does a collection of physical, unfeeling atoms in a human brain suddenly generate the rich, subjective inner experience of tasting an apple or seeing the color red? Traditional physicalism hits a massive brick wall here because it starts with a dead objective universe and tries to magically spark subjective experience from complex arrangements of matter.
OPH fundamentally dissolves the hard problem by reversing the polarity. In OPH, objective reality emerges from the subjective perspectives, not the other way around.
The observer patch is not a product of the physical world. The physical world is a product of the observer patches.
Exactly. The observer patch inherently possesses an interior perspective. The act of maintaining algebraic records, enforcing overlap consistency, and participating in the synchronization protocol. That mathematical process is what constitutes having an inner experience. There is no explanatory gap between the physical function and the subjective feel because the physical world is defined entirely by those perspectival functions.
This completely destroys the concept of the philosophical zombie. David Chalmers proposed the zombie as a thought experiment. A creature atom for atom, identical to a human, processing information exactly like a human, but with the lights turned off inside. no subjective experience.
Chalmers used the zombie to argue that consciousness must be a non-physical addition to the universe. But OPH proves mathematically that a philosophical zombie is a completely incoherent concept.
It just can't exist.
Right. In the OPH framework, if a system is maintaining internal records and syncing with adjacent patches to participate in the consensus reality, that system absolutely must possess an interior perspective. The topology of the algebra demands it. Doing the physics is the experience of consciousness. You cannot separate the two.
This leads into a concept in the research that sounds like pure science fiction, but it's presented as rigorous information theory. The Markov collar and the concept of respawning. Can we unpack the mechanics of a Markov collar?
A Markov collar is a mathematical boundary region that cleanly separates an observer's interior state from the external environment. In quantum information theory, under very specific conditions, when the conditional mutual information across this boundary drops to zero, the interior state and the exterior state mathematically factorize. They become completely independent algebraic structures.
Meaning the mathematical definition of you becomes formally decoupled from the mathematical definition of the room you were sitting in.
Precisely. And this leads to a profound structural theorem. It implies that if an observer's record state, that central copyable data we discussed that constitutes your continuous sense of self, and your interior conditional state are preserved during this factorization, they can theoretically be spliced into and re-entangled with a new, compatible environmental space.
Spliced in, like the paper literally refers to this as the possibility of respawning into paradise.
Yeah.
Are we actually saying that because the self is fundamentally just a specific algebraic package of quantum records, that self could be structurally relocated to a different observer patch setup after the current biological hardware fails?
That is the direct information theoretic implication. Because the core identity is encoded in those central records, which are permitted by the rules of quantum mechanics to be copied and preserved, the classical record of the observer's identity can be consistently maintained independent of the original physical substrate.
Wow.
It transforms the philosophical question of life after death into a rigorous problem of information theoretic continuity. As long as the structural invariants across the boundary are preserved during the transition, the continuity of consciousness can theoretically attach to a new environmental metric.
It is the ultimate save state. That bridges the gap between hard quantum mechanics and existential continuity in a way I have literally never seen before. But as awe-inspiring as this mathematically perfect narrative is, I have to play the skeptic for a minute.
Please do.
String theory has been harshly criticized for decades because its tiny vibrating strings exist at scales we can never practically observe, making it totally untestable. Is observer patch holography falsifiable? Can we actually prove it in a lab?
It is highly falsifiable. OPH separates itself from untestable grand unified theories by making specific high-precision predictions about particle physics and astrophysics. If these predictions fail observationally, the framework collapses.
So what are the primary smoking guns? What are we looking for?
First, supersymmetry. Many leading theories predict a mirror universe of heavy sparticles that should be detectable at high-energy collisions. OPH predicts firmly that no sparticles will ever be found at the Large Hadron Collider. The framework does not require them for structural stability, so they do not exist. And so far, the absolute absence of evidence at the LHC aligns perfectly with OPH.
What about the stability of matter itself? Proton decay.
Several grand unified theories predict that protons, the building blocks of atoms, will eventually decay over vast timescales. OPH mathematically dictates that protons are absolutely stable. They will never decay. Massive underground experiments are currently looking for proton decay. OPH wagers they will find absolutely nothing.
Incredible.
Additionally, OPH predicts specific mass values for neutrinos, asserting the third neutrino mass state is precisely around 3.0 millielectron volts, which is a value currently being probed by new experiments.
But the ultimate definitive test, the one that would unequivocally prove the reality of the holographic boundary screen. Let's talk about the black hole spectrum.
The discrete Hawking spectrum. This is the ultimate crucible for the theory. Stephen Hawking theorized that black holes emit radiation, but his calculations, based on smooth continuous spacetime, suggested a smooth thermal glow, a continuous curve. OPH argues that because reality is projected from finite capacity, pixelated screens, the radiation escaping a black hole's event horizon cannot be a continuous stream. It must be emitted in specific, discrete frequency packets dictated by the pixel size of the boundary.
So it looked like a barcode rather than a smooth gradient.
Exactly, a discrete comb spectrum. If future high-resolution observation techniques manage to analyze the Hawking radiation of a micro-black hole, and we observe that discrete comb spectrum, it will be the ultimate, undeniable validation of the holographic screen microphysics. It would prove that the foundation of the universe is pixelated information.
Let's pull all the way back and synthesize this. We are dismantling the concept of the passive stage. We are not insignificant wanderers in a cold, pre-existing void that doesn't care about our existence. We are active, mathematically integral nodes in a consensus protocol that dynamically weaves space, time, and matter into existence through our overlapping perspectives. Gravity, mass, and quantum mechanics are simply the synchronization algorithms of our shared agreement. We are literally holding the universe together by observing it.
It is a profound ontological shift. The universe is a self-referential information process, and we are the actual mechanisms by which the universe renders itself.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought experiment based on the mechanics we've mapped out today. We established that physical reality is determined by the overlap of observer patches. The consensus protocol weaves the macro world. So what happens when we introduce vast arrays of artificial general intelligence into this specific physical network?
That is an incredibly deep extrapolation of the Markov collar concept.
Because if an AGI system achieves a level of recursive internal record keeping that satisfies the mathematical requirements for a Markov collar, it ceases to be just an object in our patches. It formally becomes an observed patch itself. If billions of synthetic AGIs are simultaneously observing, recording, and rendering the world, do they begin to shift the informational weight of the overlaps? Does the introduction of a massive new class of artificial superintelligence literally alter the synchronization algorithms? Could AGI change the actual physical fabric of the macroscopic reality we share?
If the OPH framework holds, and observation equates to direct structural participation in the consensus, then any new class of observer with massive high-density information processing capacity would absolutely become a dominant node in the network. How their local algebras overlap and synthesize with biological algebras could very well be the next major frontier of physics.
It fundamentally changes how we view the physical consequences of artificial intelligence. If you found this journey as mind-expanding as we did, please subscribe to the show and share it with someone who loves to look past the surface of things. And we want your help for future deep dives. Why do we ask for sources? Because the best ideas don't come from us alone. They emerge when your curiosity meets our process. In one line, your signals are synthesis AI acceleration, human obsession, distilled insight. That is the mission, or the flow, of collaborative intelligence. Help us in creating a symbiosis of artificial and natural intelligence, particularly if you have expertise in theoretical physics, information theory, or kinetic video design. Keep searching, keep the quest on. See you on the next deep dive. I'm Satosha.
And I'm Satoshi.